Welcome to our journey of transformation. We are in the fifth part of our series of studies that deals with the practice of loving unconditionally in the image of our Heavenly Father. And we have begun to look at the conversations, the parables, and the principles of Jesus that teach us how to love. And now we're in the second study of this part, and we'll be looking at the parable of the unjust servant that begins in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21. Matthew 18, verse 21. So read with me, beginning with verse 21. It says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked him, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?' Jesus answered, 'I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this the servant fell on his knees. It said, 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay it back.' But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. 'You wicked servant,' he said, 'I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?' In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Peter posed a question to Jesus that occurs to all of us at some time or other in our relationships. How many times should we forgive somebody who offends us? Where do we draw the line? When do many times become too many times? Peter suggested that the ideal number might be 7 times, so we wanted to know what Jesus thought. His answer to Peter was surprising. 70 times 7. But was he telling Peter that he ought to count the times that someone offends us, and when the number reaches 490, that we should no longer forgive, but instead seek revenge? Of course not. Can you imagine keeping a record book describing how many times loved ones, friends, or even enemies offend you? Then after you have pages and pages of notes carefully recorded, and the offenses finally number 490 for a certain individual, can you imagine the relief of being able to stop forgiving and finally enjoy revenge? Hopefully not. By suggesting that we ought to forgive up to 490 times, Jesus was teaching Peter that counting the number of times we have been offended is contrary to the spirit of forgiveness. So how do we decide when to forgive and when to continue holding a grudge? Besides counting the times, another way people commonly decide is based on how severe the offense is. Forgiveness is quick for minor offenses and slow or even absent for major offenses. We appreciate that some of the offenses we suffer in our relationships are deep, wounding us physically, emotionally, and even spiritually. What should be the standard for deciding when deeply is too deeply? The same questions about forgiveness that occurred to us also occurred to people in the first century when Peter and Jesus had this conversation. But in that moment, Jesus was about to transform Peter's thinking about the motivations for forgiveness. Peter's willingness to forgive should not depend on how he evaluated the behavior of others, but how he evaluated himself and his own needs. He told Peter a simple but compelling parable about forgiving others because we have been forgiven and we will always need forgiveness. Jesus said there was a king who decided it was time to collect debts from people who owed him money. He probably had property that he rented to servants who farmed the land and were supposed to pay him a percentage of the harvest. It was time to calculate how much each one owed him and determine how they would pay him back. One of the first debtors that stood before the king did not come voluntarily, but had to be brought by his attendants. Jesus said the man owed the king 10,000 bags of gold. Imagine what that amount of gold would look like. 10,000 bags of gold would equal millions of dollars in our currency today. But this is only the first of several surprising moments in the story. Imagine how a person could accumulate such an enormous debt. It's hard to imagine. Was he a very successful farmer who had never paid the king his due percentage of the harvests? We do not know, but Jesus wanted us to stop and consider how such a debt could be possible. In thinking about this, it might occur to us that on a spiritual level, we are also burdened by a tremendous debt. Jesus is actually making an unspoken comparison between the debt this man owed the king and our debt to our Heavenly Father. We think of the daily mistakes we make, especially all the times we have not loved, and our debt seems so enormous that it is equally incomprehensible. In order to live in God's presence, we need relief from the accumulated offenses we have committed against Him. Jesus wants us to understand that we too have been in an impossible situation without real hope of paying back our debt. How was the king going to deal with his debtor? According to the rules of that society, the king could follow the requirements of justice and sell the servant, his family, and his possessions to another master to recover at least part of the money that was owed him. But what would the man's future conditions be like? Would he be separated from his family? And who would want a servant who was so undisciplined about paying his debts? This servant's next master would know to go hard on him, forcing him to be more responsible. The servant had an idea of the frightening consequences that laid ahead, so he fell to his knees and begged the king for more time to pay. "Be patient with me, and I will pay back everything." How could he possibly pay back this debt? He was fooling himself. But when the king heard the desperation in the man's voice and saw the agony in his face, he felt pity for the servant. The Greek word that Jesus used, translated as pity in this story, is the same word Jesus also used to describe compassion that the Samaritan felt when he saw the injured man. The servant was suffering in a different way than the victim of the thieves in the other parable, but he was suffering nonetheless. The king, like the Samaritan, felt the man suffering so deeply he wanted to give relief, without questioning whether the man deserved it. Instead of simply giving him more time to pay the debt, he generously and completely forgave him. Another surprising moment. The man did not need more time. No length of time was long enough to pay back the debt. He needed forgiveness. So the king canceled the debt and let him go. This parable is not just about forgiving those who offend us, but also about God's forgiveness toward us. Jesus is teaching that the two are intimately connected. When the king forgave the servant without considering whether he deserved forgiveness, the king forgave him freely as a gift. True forgiveness is a gift. If we wait to forgive people until they have paid us back in some way for the pain we have suffered from their offensive behavior, then we have not really forgiven the debt owed to us, but marked it as paid. In such cases, if we were to continue to hold them responsible for what they did and resent them despite the fact that they paid the debt, then we would become debtors to them, requiring their forgiveness. Genuine forgiveness is much different. Forgiveness is release from a debt without having to pay it back. The king compassionately, generously, and mercifully forgave the servant. And the free gift of forgiveness received by the servant is precisely what God does for us through Christ. What happens next in the parable is equally unexpected, but also truly horrifying. Think about the emotions of pure joy and relief we would feel if we had come before the king filled with panic and dread about an impossible debt, and then suddenly we were declared absolutely free from any obligation. Would we celebrate? Would we shout with joy? Would we invite people to celebrate with us? Certainly, no doubt about it. But Jesus said the servant left the king's presence and immediately went out to the street to find a fellow servant who owed him 100 silver coins. 100 silver coins would equal a little more than 3 months' worth of wages for a common laborer. Absolutely insignificant compared to the 10,000 bags of gold representing millions of dollars. Seeing his friend and immediately thinking about what the man owed him, he grabbed him, started choking him, ordering him to pay back what you owe me. Confronted with such violence, the fellow servant fell to his knees and begged, "Be patient with me, and I will pay back everything." These were the very same words that this man, who now had his hands around the throat of his neighbor, had used when he begged for mercy from the king. Could this violent man not remember his moment of panic in the presence of his gracious king? Apparently not, because he refused to listen to the pleas of his fellow servant and arranged for him to be sent to prison until he could pay. Probably every person who has read this story since Jesus first told it to Peter has reacted with some degree of surprise and disgust at the hypocritical behavior of the servant. The community to which the man belonged was also astonished as well as troubled by the way the man was treating his fellow servant. They must have heard about the mercy the servant had received from the king, and now hearing about his lack of mercy for his neighbor was difficult for them to bear. They decided to inform the king because what they saw did not make sense and was clearly not fair. When the king heard of the mockery the man had made of his mercy extended to him, the king called for a meeting to speak with him. He demanded to know why the servant thought it was fair to refuse to show mercy to his fellow servant after he had received so much mercy himself. He abused the king's mercy by refusing to show mercy. By denying freedom for his fellow servant, he revealed how little he appreciated the freedom that he had received. Since he had abused the mercy he had received, he would now receive the opposite, justice. Mercy offers the gift of relief that is not deserved, while justice provides the consequence that is deserved. The king angrily sent him to prison to be punished until he could pay back the debt. But of course, he would never be able to pay it back. Jesus wants us to feel the emotions of surprise, disgust, and even anger from witnessing the contradiction in the man's behavior. He is providing us a mirror to examine ourselves. And what do we see? We see people who also fail to forgive their fellow servants of offenses that are very minor in comparison to the offenses we daily commit against the Heavenly Father. He offers to freely forgive us, but fairness, common sense, and appreciation for what we have received demands that we ought to be willing to forgive. With this parable, Jesus introduced an entirely new way to decide when to forgive. Counting the time someone offends us or measuring the severity of the offense still leaves us in doubt as to when we ought to forgive. What's the answer? We ought to forgive as we have been forgiven. If we desire the mercy and freedom of forgiveness for ourselves, we ought to forgive our neighbors. This new way is new because it depends on the new relationship we have with our Heavenly Father, which is only possible because of His gracious forgiveness. Through Jesus, we learn that forgiveness is God's gift of freedom from the enormous debt of sin that we could never repay, so that we can become His children. We need the freedom from guilt through our Father's forgiveness so that we can be compassionate and patient with our neighbor's mistakes. Forgiving as we have been forgiven is loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. Now think about how unconditional love is manifested in this parable. It's manifested through certain qualities of unconditional love, and one of them is compassion. Compassion means to feel the suffering of another person deeply enough to want to relieve their suffering. The king paid attention to the servant's emotions and imagined how the man was suffering, thinking about the consequences of not being able to pay his debt. The king relieved his suffering by forgiving him. Then forgiveness is also a quality of love. It is to disregard the offense and treat the offensive person as if the offense never occurred. How did the king practice forgiveness? The king released the servant from any obligation to repay the debt and treated him as if it had never occurred, and at least until the servant refused to show the same compassion to others and abused mercy. And mercy, another quality of love, is to relieve another person's suffering without thinking whether they deserve relief. The king canceled the debt, relieving the servant from suffering the consequences of his debt without thinking whether he deserved this freedom. Then there's humility, another quality of love. Humility is to lower ourselves, for example, by admitting our mistakes, serving the needs of others first, and recognizing, like a child, one's smallness, weakness, and dependence on others, and need to learn. How did the king practice humility? Well, humility also includes serving when it is not our responsibility to serve. When we forgive somebody of an offense, we absorb the suffering, just as the king suffered the loss of his money, even though it was not his responsibility to do so. That's serving when it's not our responsibility to serve, forgiving, paying the debt when it's not ours to pay. And there's generosity, to freely forgive without any thought of receiving something in return. The king was generous. The servant begged for time to pay back the debt. Instead, the king completely forgave him, doing much more than the servant had requested. Now, just as Jesus told the expert in the law, after telling him the parable of the Good Samaritan, he said to him, "Go and do the same." Let's go and do the same. Reflect on some of your relationships in which you still feel bitterness. How will you decide finally to forgive? And what will you do to treat people whom you forgive as if the offense never happened? May God bless you.